Once upon a time in 1845, two Englishmen, James Pilkington and Henry Threlfall Wilson, founded a brilliant shipping company called the White Star Line. Its purpose was to capitalize on the Australian gold rush by sailing passenger ships to the Southern Hemisphere. Its first acquired ship was Elizabeth, and its first built steamship was Royal Standard. But like so many others in the shipping trade, they had their share of bad luck. The Taileur, which they described as superior to any ship hitherto dispatched to the Australian colonies, ran aground off Lambay Island and sank on her maiden voyage in 1854 with the deaths of half the people on board. In 1863, the Lord Raglan vanished with 300 people. The following year, Royal Standard struck an iceberg on her return trip, but she managed to limp back home. And on top of everything else, the company was being driven to bankruptcy. But that wasn't even the worst of it. As late as the mid-19th century, ocean voyages were grim necessities instead of pleasure cruises. After his 1842 voyage from Liverpool, English author Charles Dickens called his Boston-bound ship not unlike a gigantic hearse with windows in the sides. Of his bunk he wrote, "Nothing smaller for sleeping in was ever made except coffins." American author Mark Twain was equally unimpressed with a similar mid-century voyage of his own. He complained of no place to smoke but in an ugly den with no seats. He wrote, "The seas broke in through the cracks every little while and drenched the cabin thoroughly." Even after commercial ships began to sail on fixed schedules, passengers endured cramped, unsanitary conditions for up to a month. Food was bad, disease was rampant, and the sea was unpredictable. Of every 100 ships that would set sail, 16 would never reach port, some even disappearing without a trace. Some ships sank, like the Birkenhead, a troop carrier that went down off Cape Town with 454 drowned. A mid-Atlantic fire claimed 471 lives aboard the Austria, an emigrant ship bound for America. It wouldn't be until the invention of wireless communication that the vanishing of certain ships, like the city of Glasgow, would cease. The North Atlantic may have been harsh, but the world was getting smaller. Travel and mail between Europe and North America were increasing. By the late 19th century, technology and ship design were advancing to meet these needs, and shipbuilders focused on comfort, style, and speed. With each advance, the transatlantic run took less time. Seeking to make the most of this trend, a 32-year-old Liverpool businessman named Thomas Henry Ismay legally incorporated the name, emblem, and goodwill of the nearly bankrupted White Star Line he bought in 1867 for £1,000. Formerly the directors of the National Line, Ismay and his friend George Hamilton Fletcher, saw the commercial possibilities of introducing superior iron ships to the North Atlantic passenger trade. Fletcher, who also owned a fleet of sailing ships, served as the business force behind Ismay's visions. Their Oceanic Steam Navigation Company found the capital for a revitalized White Star Line in financial backer Gustav Schwabe, another Liverpudlian. Following a billiard game with Ismay, Schwabe arranged the deal with one main stipulation: that Ismay work exclusively with the Belfast shipbuilding firm Harland and Wolff, partly owned by Schwabe's nephew, Gustav Wolff. The following year, Ismay brought aboard another friend, William Imrie, whose father had been an early mentor in his career, and Oceanic Steam Navigation became Ismay, Imrie and Company. Thus prepared, the new White Star ordered 6 innovative liners. The first one was Oceanic, and she sailed in March 1871. The remaining 5 were Baltic, Republic, Tropic, Asiatic, and Atlantic. All were single-propeller, iron-hulled liners. Within just a few years, Harland and Wolff began using steel instead of iron. As the technology advanced and the commercial liners needed more power, the number of propellers would increase to 2 and later 3. The new luxury liners were built for a new kind of passenger who can afford them. In their world, a dog arrived at a party in a $15,000 diamond collar. An elegant dinner was served entirely on horseback. Newfound wealth found a new style during the Gilded Age, a name given by American author and social critic Mark Twain to the last 3 decades of the 19th century. The industrialized Western world was secure and prosperous in the years following the American Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War. Poverty was still everywhere, but the growing middle class now enjoyed leisure time, and the upper class flaunted its wealth. The great minds of science and business were speeding up a pulsing industrial beat that drowned out Mother Nature's slower, gentler rhythms. Progress was the new god for those who wanted to see results larger than life. Few thought about the consequences. Such consequences lead to the building of safer ships. On April 1st, 1873, the White Star liner Atlantic sank off the coast of Nova Scotia. Slowed by bad weather en route from Liverpool to New York, she was running low on coal. Captain James Wilson changed course for Halifax, but the ship ran onto Meagher's Rock in the middle of the night. During her quick sinking, half the lifeboats were washed away, and of her 952 passengers and crew, 560 died. Most of the survivors clung to the bow, which stayed above the surface. This was considered the worst North Atlantic shipping disaster to date. As ships grew larger during the latter decades of the 19th century, more lives and bigger investments were at stake on a wild, uncaring ocean that no human effort would ever be able to tame. Greater speed and power were necessary to keep up with the competition. Improved safety features were crucial to make sure that passengers, the most valuable payload of all, reached their destination alive and, if possible, with words of praise on their lips. During the Gilded Age, bigger certainly was better in the war of commerce between shipbuilders. Increasing trade and immigration demanded ships that would accommodate both steerage passengers and the thrill-seeking rich. In March 1887, Harland and Wolff laid the keels for 2 White Star ships that would be considered the first modern ocean liners. Big, fast, and comfortable, Teutonic and majestic. 10,000 tons each would reach a speed of 20 knots, crossing the Atlantic in a mere 7.5 days. White Star's chief rivals, the British Cunard Line and the German Hamburg America Line, would have to rise to the challenge. However, not everyone was optimistic about the industrial race towards the 20th century. Morgan Robertson, an American writer and self-professed psychic, spun a cautionary tale in his 1898 novel, Futility. He told of Titan, a huge ocean liner that struck a North Atlantic iceberg one April night and sank with great loss of life. The name, size, and speed of his ship were hauntingly similar to those of a liner that White Star would build 11 years later. This short novel, with its title suggesting Mother Nature's opinion of Gilded Age values, was widely published in American magazines. One American with no fear of progress was financier J.P. Morgan, a railroad tycoon who was both admired for his runaway success as a capitalist and vilified for his ruthless business ethics. The booming Atlantic passenger trade had caught his eye. After several years of investing in some of the German companies, he decided to expand further into the lucrative world of the British companies. To do this, he started a price war with the lines he already owned and then made attractive offers to those British, European, and American lines that were losing money. His international navigation company, which began in 1893 with the purchase of the American Inman and Red Star shipping lines, grew to become International Mercantile Marine after acquiring the Atlantic Transport, Leyland, and Dominion lines. Morgan's desire to own a major British shipping enterprise focused on the White Star Line. In December 1902, he bought White Star for £10 million, 10 times its earnings in 1900. There had been early opposition from the Ismay family, which had built the line up from nothing and still held a controlling interest, but the sale eventually went through. It was an offer that the shareholders simply could not refuse. The liners continued to sail proudly under the Union Jack, but now an American hand rested heavily on the tiller. Meanwhile, to secure British marine resources against such buyers like Morgan, the government approached Cunard with an offer. In exchange for making its ships available to the Royal Navy should there be a war, Cunard would receive access to a steady stream of government loans for its competition against White Star, Hamburg America, and any other line that might edge its way to the front ranks of the shipping race. The unspoken objective was that, in times of peace and prosperity, this agreement would ensure Cunard's continuing participation in the British tax base. The White Star Line flourished with International Mercantile Marine's backing. 1 year after the purchase, J.P. Morgan offered White Star's director, J. Bruce Ismay, the position of managing director and president of IMM and its subsidiaries. As the son of Thomas Henry Ismay, Bruce had taken charge of White Star 4 years earlier, along with co-owners Harold Sanderson and Lord William J. Peary, and impressed Morgan with his abilities and vision. By this time, Thomas had passed away, and his partner William Imrie retired from the board along with W.S. Graves and Bruce's brother James. The influence of the Ismay family on transatlantic passenger trade had come a long way since Thomas first purchased a failing business for a mere £1,000. In 1907, the Cunard Line amazed the world with 2 revolutionary ships, Lusitania and Mauretania. At 31,000 tons, their 4 turbine propellers could drive them across the Atlantic in less than 5 days at a speed of 28 knots. Mauretania would hold the record as the world's fastest liner for 20 years. Lusitania featured the unlimited elegance of Europe's great hotels, complete with beautifully appointed drawing rooms and plush lounges built by master craftsmen. Cunard now had the fastest British ship, an honor that once belonged to White Star's 25,000-ton Adriatic. The next step up in size and luxury would have to be something even more spectacular. While Cunard had positioned itself for speed, White Star would astound the world with sheer spectacle. That same year, over a pleasant summer dinner in London, White Star's Bruce Ismay and Harland and Wolff's Lord William Peary conceived a new line of ships. They envisioned the largest moving objects ever made by man. 3 liners to surpass both Cunard and their German rivals. At 45,000 tons, these ships would be 50% bigger and 100 feet longer than anything yet built, able to carry more passengers to America than ever before. These 3 liners would be constructed to lure the world's wealthiest travelers with their magnificence. They would be called Olympic, Titanic, and Gigantic. A year after these 3 new luxury liners were envisioned, signatures on a contract set the dream in motion. Bruce Ismay, Harold Sanderson, and other ranking White Star members arrived in Belfast to review Harland and Wolff's construction plans for the 3 new wonder ships. Lord Peary presented the drawings, assisted by his nephew and managing director Thomas Andrews. The contract, signed on July 31st, stated that Harland and Wolff would begin construction of 2 liners now and the 3rd later. This agreement signaled an economic boom for Belfast, whose lifeblood was shipbuilding, and a higher profile for Southampton, fast becoming England's leading passenger port. White Star encouraged Harland and Wolff's designers to pursue their vision of grandeur with no expense spared. The planners and draftsmen proposed huge liners whose passenger amenities would make them the most awesome vessels afloat. First-class passengers would make their dramatic entrances and exits on a sweeping grand staircase beneath an elegant dome of glass and iron. First- and second-class passengers would also have elevators to carry them between decks. The middle deck would feature a swimming pool for passenger fitness. A Turkish bath would make soothing relaxation possible even on the high seas. The extravagance had to be obvious to all. Alexander Carlyle was the chief designer who oversaw this vision. After his retirement next year, it would be Thomas Andrews who would bring to life every detail of these ships. The next generation of ocean liners moved from the draftsman's table to the real world of the ship workers. To accommodate the building of these massive liners, Harland and Wolff had to convert 3 of their already enormous berths into 2 bigger ones. By the end of the year, they had built the tallest gantry ever, which towered over Belfast and laid Olympic's first keel plate beneath it. Its materials and equipment weighed over 6,000 tons, and it occupied a space 840 feet long by 270 feet wide. Between launching and sailing, the heavy lifting was handled by floating cranes, which were towering hinged structures aboard specially counterweighted barges. This was the equipment that allowed the shipworkers to install enormous pieces such as the boilers and the funnels. They were hiring shipworkers in record numbers. The channel of the River Lagan had to be dredged to 50 feet for ships with a deeper draft. In Southampton, White Star arranged for similar dredging. Meanwhile, Bruce Ismay was in America, doing whatever was necessary to ensure that the piers in New York Harbor would be long enough for his liners to dock. When Ismay approached the Harbor Board with a request to extend International Mercantile Marine's docks, however, the board refused, citing its concerns about navigational safety. Ismay then appealed to the business community, which obviously stood to gain from any increase in passenger traffic. The issue was taken to Washington, D.C., where the War Department held the ultimate jurisdiction over all port access in the U.S. With some hard feelings in New York, IMM finally received permission to prepare for the arrival of its wonder ships. On March 31st, shipworkers laid Titanic's first keel plate next to Olympic. As construction continued, White Star prepared the world for the first passenger liners to exceed 40,000 tons. Floating luxury hotels with pools, palm trees, and no end of elegant detail. To evoke their mythic stature, Bruce Ismay had drawn his new ships' names from Greek mythology. Olympic was named for Mount Olympus, home of the gods. Titanic honored the Titans, powerful giants who challenged the gods, only to have their arrogance punished by a spectacular defeat. Ismay was obviously impressed by the Titans' size and strength, not their ultimate fate. The Board of Trade, the British government agency that regulated commercial traffic, submitted a set of guidelines that Parliament passed as the Merchant Shipping Act of 1894. Among the articles was a requirement that the number of lifeboats carried should be based on the ship's weight and not a head count of the passengers and crew. So by 1909, all ships needed to carry lifeboats, but not everyone agreed on how many. Though final plans for Titanic and Olympic called for 16 boats each, plus 4 Engelhart collapsible boats that could be stored more easily. They were designed by Harland and Wolff's chief draftsman, Roderick Chisholm, and built at the shipyard. Of the original 16, 14 were 30 feet long and, when fully provisioned, had a capacity of 65. These boats, 3 through 16, were attached to their davits and hung inward on the boat deck. Boats 1 and 2 were emergency cutters, seating 40 each. They were already attached to davits, but were swung out and ready to use in case, for instance, someone fell overboard. Collapsibles A through D, whose folding canvas sides allowed for easy deck storage, could each hold 47 people. A and B were lashed to the roof of the deckhouse, or officers' quarters near the forend of the boat deck, while C and D were stored under the davits for boats 1 and 2. All were made of wood and equipped with oars, a detachable mast, and a sail. Designer Alexander Carlyle originally saw 48 and possibly even 64 boats per ship, using new davits by the Welland Company. Bruce Ismay was not interested in erring on the side of safety and disagreed with Carlyle, claiming that 48 lifeboats would take up too much deck space and cause passengers to worry. The new ships were as good as lifeboats themselves, and the possible needs for the smaller craft would be rescuing a person who fell overboard, or at the worst, carrying passengers between ships in the case of some mid-ocean emergency, presumably a problem with the other ship. Since Ismay was the customer, and the kind who didn't want good deck space wasted on unnecessary precaution, Carlyle was not about to argue with him. In the end, 20 boats, with a total of 1,178 seats, were considered adequate for 3,547 passengers and crew. In fact, Titanic and Olympic would actually exceed the outdated British Board of Trade requirements by 17%. But there still weren't enough lifeboats to accommodate every passenger. On May 31, 1911, Lord and Lady Pirrie, both celebrating birthdays, hosted a group of distinguished visitors in Belfast for the launch of Titanic and the completion of Olympic. The guests included J. Bruce Ismay, IMM owner J.P. Morgan, White Star director Harold Sanderson, and former White Star partner W.S. Graves. After being received at the shipyard office, they moved to a specially built grandstand that was set apart from the thousands of people who came to witness the historic moment. Aided by 23 tons of soap, tallow, and train oil spread on the slipway, the ship slid easily into the River Lagan, reaching 12 knots and coming to a gentle stop 1 minute later. She was then towed to the fitting-out basin for completion. In spite of the red flag hoisted on the stern, 2 rockets, and an 8-minute warning, shipwright James Dobbin had been fatally injured by a falling support he was knocking out during Titanic's launch, which pinned his leg. Unaware of the mishap, White Star officials celebrated over lunch, accepted the now completed Olympic, and sailed her to Liverpool to begin her maiden voyage. It was quite odd to some, however, that neither of the ships were christened. White Star was a modern company that had little interest in such time-honored ceremonies as beginning each launch with a christening. No one broke a champagne bottle across the bow. Instead, Harland and Wolff's managing director Charles A. Payne, at a nod from Lord Pirrie, signaled a few foremen to open a release valve. The spectacle of the event was watching the massive hull slide into the River Lagan while the crowd cheered and nearby ships tooted their horns and sirens. The superstitious wondered if there would someday be dire consequences for launching ships without a gesture of divine protection. The pragmatic simply shrugged and said, "They just builds 'em and shoves 'em in." As for Dobbin, his friends dragged him to safety at the last moment, and the foreman included him in the head count. But Dobbins was in no condition to celebrate the launch. He was taken by ambulance to Belfast's Royal Victoria Hospital and died the next day from contusions and shock. He was 43. Additionally, the launch of Titanic was met with skepticism by an editor at the Irish News and Belfast Morning News. He reminded his readers what Zeus had done to the enormous Titans when they challenged the gods. He smote the strong and daring Titans with thunderbolts, and their final abiding place was in some limbo beneath the lowest depths of the Tartarus. This editorial went on to wonder why an image-conscious shipbuilder would name such a magnificent creation after a group of giants who symbolized the vain efforts of mere strength to resist to ordinances of the more civilized order established by Zeus, their triumphant enemy. The irony of these words would soon ring with a terrible echo. Olympic sailed on her maiden voyage from Southampton on June 14, 1911, and arrived in New York on June 21st. Rated for a top speed of 21 knots, she came nowhere near the 25-knot records being set by Mauretania and Lusitania. White Star's intention was that its wonder ships be more luxurious than Cunard's, not faster. During the latter's outfitting, Olympic and Titanic were identical in almost every way. But after Olympic's completion, Thomas Andrews undertook several improvements to make Titanic even more luxurious than her sister ship. More first-class staterooms were added to the spacious A deck. The forward section of the first-class promenade was enclosed with plate glass windows to protect strolling passengers from spray thrown up by the bow. The only real technical change involved the wireless room, which received extra soundproofing to keep the operators from being distracted by activity on the boat deck. Like the Olympic, Titanic's safety features set new standards for marine technology. Harland and Wolff had given Titanic a double-plated keel and a system of watertight compartments that would allow any two of them to flood without sinking the ship. These 15 watertight compartments were the areas on the lowest deck of the ship, divided by lateral steel walls called bulkheads. The compartments ranged in length from 50 to 60 feet. Alternately, towards the front of the ship, she would be safe if any 3 of the first 5 compartments were to flood. Even in a worst-case scenario, if every single one of the first 4 compartments were to fill with water, the ship could conceivably stay afloat. Should the hull ever be punctured in one or more places, electric watertight doors would close automatically. The doors were operated using a drop system, held in open position by a friction clutch, and closed by an electromagnetic impulse that released the clutch. The door would then slide down its track, sealing the hatchway between compartments. This system could operate in 3 separate ways. The method most talked about was by an electric switch on Titanic's bridge, which could be closed at the discretion of a ship's officer. This switch specifically closed only the doors that were vertical. There was also an operating lever in the compartment to be used by an on-site crew member who might require the door to close. The vertical watertight doors also had to be closed by hand. Finally, a float beneath the floor plates of each compartment would lift in the event of flooding, releasing the clutch automatically if the door had not already been closed intentionally. Once closed, a watertight door would have to be reopened manually. Powerful pumps, capable of flushing out 4 tons per minute, would empty each flooding compartment long before water could reach the gaps between the top of the bulkheads and the ceiling plates. The only flaw in the system was that the bulkheads did not reach the ceiling plates. Titanic's designers believed that the water level in any compartment would never rise high enough to spill over into the next one. The Shipbuilder, a shipbuilding and marine engineering magazine, published a special edition in midsummer 1911 that celebrated White Star's huge new ships, describing their assumed invulnerability in the following quote, which was frequently misquoted and led to a popular misconception about the 2 ships. Each door is held in the open position by a suitable friction clutch, which can be instantly released by means of a powerful electromagnet controlled from the captain's bridge, so that in the event of accident, or at any time when it may be considered advisable, the captain can, by simply moving an electric switch, instantly close the doors throughout and make the vessel practically unsinkable. In the public mind, this was as good as just plain unsinkable. Expectations for Titanic now ran even higher. But even unsinkable ships can have accidents. On September 20th, 1911, Olympic left Southampton on her 5th voyage. She had just made the difficult double turn around Calshot Spit and a bank called the Bramble when she passed the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Hawke, which suddenly veered toward her and rammed her midships on the starboard side. Hawke's bow thrusted 8 feet into the vast hull, tearing a 40-foot gash below the waterline and nearly capsized. The new liner lay paralyzed at Osborne Bay, off the Isle of Wight, waiting until the tide turned and she could make her way back to Southampton. Her passengers were taken off by tender, and her voyage was cancelled. Olympic was towed to Belfast for repairs, arriving at Harland and Wolff on October 6th. Her repairs called for the replacement of a damaged starboard propeller crankshaft with one that was to be used on Titanic. Titanic still sat in the fitting-out basin, her labor and materials temporarily diverted by Olympic's emergency. In the naval inquiry following this incident, naval engineers determined that water displacement caused by the huge vessel had swept the much smaller boat into its wake. Nautical Magazine, the mouthpiece for British merchant marine officers, sneered at the water tank simulations as engineers playing with bathtub toys in pleasant remembrance of younger days. However, the Admiralty Court found Olympic at fault. Since she was under the command of a harbor pilot at the time, the captain and chief officer were exonerated of any blame. Work on Olympic delayed Titanic's scheduled maiden voyage by 3 weeks. Because of this and a previous accident with a smaller vessel, some suggested that the new ships were just too big. Of course, the Hawke wasn't Olympic's only close call. On June 21st, 1911, arriving in New York on her maiden voyage, Olympic was escorted to IMM's pier on the North River by 12 tugboats. The one near her stern, O.L. Hallenbeck, was sucked against the Olympic by a reverse turn of her starboard propeller, intended by the pilot to help steer the ship. The huge blade cut off Hallenbeck's own stern, rudder, wheel shaft, and all. The tugboat's owner sued, White Star countersued. The press had a good laugh at Hallenbeck's expense, and no one was able to prove anything. The following year, on February 2nd, 1912, en route from New York to Southampton, Olympic threw a propeller blade in mid-Atlantic. One of the huge screws came loose from its mounting and went spinning into the depths. The ship completed her voyage safely, although at a slower speed than anyone would prefer. After unloading passengers and cargo, she went back to Harland and Wolff for repair in dry dock. The work completed, Olympic returned to service on March 4th, nearly grounding on a mud bank on her way out of Belfast. Fortunately, there was no damage this time. To the people of Belfast, the wonder ships that rose above the local skyline were the pride of their city. Harland and Wolff employed nearly 15,000 men, most of whom had bent their backs in labor over Olympic and Titanic. Although the work was hard, hours long, vacations few, and they certainly couldn't afford a first-class passage on the ships they built, the men and their families felt a personal attachment to these great liners. For these craftsmen, there was no greater satisfaction than to have the eyes of the world rest admiringly upon their work. According to one shipworker at Harland and Wolff, daily life there during the construction of the wonder ships was hard, but worth it. It was a 9-hour day, 49-hour working week. Working these hours, a tradesman might earn $2 a week, and if he worked all night Friday and all day Saturday, he could boost his earnings up to $5. There were no special amenities or modern facilities, such as canteens and showers. Other than Sundays, the only holidays that the men received were 2 days at Christmas, 2 at Easter, and a week in July. All holidays were unpaid. This included launch days, which some might see as a time of celebration or a moment to admire a job well done. What it really meant was that some married men's families had to endure a certain amount of hardship, the loss of a day's pay, people being so poor, and money and work, and being so scarce. As a safety precaution, but certainly added hardship to some workers, no smoking was allowed anywhere in the yard. On March 31, 1912, Titanic, the world's largest ship, was completed. Her 882-foot hull was built then more of 2,000-inch thick steel plates held together by more than 3 million rivets. 2 massive anchors would hold her in place, one for each side, with a third stored in reserve on the forecastle. 29 boilers would drive her 2 colossal reciprocating engines and single turbine, generating up to 46,000 horsepower. Her 2 wing propellers had 3 blades each, with a full diameter of 23.5 feet. The central turbine propeller had a 16.5-foot diameter. The blades of the outer screws were made of bronze and the inner screw of manganese bronze. The bosses, or rings that turned on the shafts, were made of cast steel. Her displacement weight was 52,310 tons, even more than Olympic. The cost of building and fully equipping Titanic had come to £1.5 million, or $7.5 million, nearly $125 million by today's standards. The White Star Line anticipated a quick and glorious return on its investment. 2 days after her completion, Titanic's officers conducted her sea trials in Belfast Lough. They practiced making turns with this huge new ship, then steamed her out towards the North Channel, practice more turns, and bring her back after 4.5 hours. Satisfied with her performance, the officials at Harland and Wolff proclaimed Titanic fit to sail. Bruce Ismay accepted her on behalf of the White Star Line. At 8 p.m., the largest ship in the world left Belfast for Southampton. One of these officers, a Mr. Charles H. Lightoller, was notably impressed with Titanic's powerful mechanics. After running our trials, we finally took over from the builders and proceeded round to Southampton. It was clear to everybody on board that we had a ship that was going to create the greatest stir British shipping circles had ever known. For one thing, she was the first ship to be fitted with a third screw, driven by a low-powered turbine. For maneuvering, the 2 wing screws alone were used, but once clear of the land, steam from low-pressure cylinders was turned into this turbine, and undoubtedly gave her a wonderful turn of speed. At midnight on April 3rd, after steaming down Britain's west coasts and passing her sister ship Olympic at sea, Titanic arrived at the White Star Dock in Southampton. She would have a week to prepare for her maiden voyage. White Star began to recruit most of the necessary crew members on Saturday, April 6th. They would take on about 900 people, including a deck crew of over 50, nearly 100 stokers, 35 engineers, and 300 stewards and stewardesses. Of all these people, 699 gave Southampton as their home address. Most were men, although 23 of the nearly 300 stewards were female. The people who worked aboard the ship were assigned to one of 3 departments: deck, engine, or victualling. The deck department's 66 members included the captain and navigation officers, quartermasters, boatswains, lamp trimmers, the surgeon, carpenters, and able-bodied seamen. This last group, ABs for short, had a different set of duties on a steamship than their counterparts on a sailing ship. With the business of moving the ship through the water handled mostly by the engineer department, the ABs were more like general custodians. They mopped decks, touched up paint, coiled and tied ropes, and generally performed any maintenance tasks that were necessary in the ship's exterior regions. The engine department's 326 members included engineers, electricians, greasers, trimmers, and stokers. It was their job to run and maintain everything mechanical and electrical about the ship. Because of all the coal dust and machine oil in their working environments, especially those who worked with the furnaces, they were commonly known as the Black Gang. The victualling department employed the remaining 500 or so people whose job titles fit neither of the above categories. In addition to the obvious waiters, cooks, chefs, bakers, and scullions, there were also stewards and stewardesses, the purser and his staff, barbers, clerks, elevator operators, and even the men who worked in the Marconi wireless room. Notably absent from this list are the musicians. They were contract labor, paid £4 per month by their booking agency, and traveling on Titanic as second-class passengers. Because their agency expenses were so high, the musicians depended on passenger tips for their livelihood. The shipboard restaurants and the barbershop were run as concessions. Their workers officially paid only 1 shilling as a token of their responsibility to the captain. Otherwise, passengers paid them directly for their services. Of those in the victualling department who received regular wages, butchers and bakers earned from £4, 10 shillings to £6 per voyage. The scullions were paid £3.10, the cooks £4.10 to £7, depending on their duties, and the head chef made $20 per voyage. First-class stewards were paid $3.15, while the stewardesses were never paid more than $3.10. The chief steward received 20. The senior wireless operator was paid £4 for his efforts, and the junior wireless operator received 2 and 6 pence. In the engine department, walks ran selectly here. Trimmers earned 5 and stockers 6 and greasers and leading stockers 6 Assistant electricians were paid 8. Most engineers earned 8 and up to 1 and the chief engineer brought in 35 per week. Most of the rent and file deck department were valued at a £5 weight. The 6th officer would be paid £8, while the chief officer earned 25. The rest of the officers' rates ranged between these two amounts. That same Saturday, the first of the cargo arrived at the dock for loading. There would be 559 tons in all, including practical items like textiles, machinery, and furniture, as well as more unusual things such as anchovies, golf balls, tennis balls, and ostrich feathers. For Titanic to sail, she needed coal, 592 tons of it. Normally, this would be easy. However, the coal miners of England were organizing to improve their collective situation. On January 12, 1912, they voted to strike for a minimum wage. Mine owners and government officials, recognizing the far-reaching effects of such an action, managed to placate the union for a few weeks. However, after talks with Prime Minister Asquith broke down, the workers left their jobs on February 22nd. Shipping, rail lines, and much industry were at a near standstill. To ensure that its massive new liner would have enough coal to sail on schedule, the White Star Line canceled 2 other ships' departures and bought coal from outside sources. Because of the strike, there was no money coming into the many local households that earned their living from the sea. When Titanic would finally steam out of the River Test, 3/4 of her crew would be Southampton residents. Even though the strike was settled on April 6th, it took days for the mining and processing of coal to catch up with England's needs. For the crew who had signed on to sail the ship and serve her passengers, Titanic was unlike anything they had seen. A few had worked on Olympic, but to everyone else, it was a challenge to remember names and locations on so big a ship, as Charles Lightoller once said. It is difficult to convey any idea of the size of a ship like the Titanic, when you could actually walk miles along decks and passages, covering different ground all the time. I was thoroughly familiar with pretty well every type of ship afloat, from a battleship and a barge. But it took me 14 days before I could with confidence find my way from one part of that ship to another by the shortest route. A sailor does not walk round with a plan in his pocket. He must carry his ship in his head, and in an emergency such as fire, must be able to get where he wants by sheer instinct, certainly without a chance of getting lost on the way. Violet Jessup, a stewardess already familiar with the Olympic, was thrilled that designer Thomas Andrews asked some stewards how he could make Titanic even more comfortable than Olympic. It was quite unusual for members of the catering department to be consulted about changes that would benefit their comforts or ease their toil, she once said. So when the designer Thomas Andrews paid us this thoughtful compliment, we realized it was a great privilege. Our esteem for him, already high, knew no bounds. Captain Edward J. Smith boarded Titanic on Sunday. The very soul of grace and confidence, his pleasant attitude and pristine record made him the ideal commander. Crew members respected him, and wealthy passengers went out of their way to sail with him. Some had even switched their bookings to Titanic when learning that he would be in command. In a 1907 interview, he explained why passengers and crew felt safe under his command. When anyone asks me how I can best describe my experiences in nearly 40 years at sea, I merely say, uneventful. Of course, there have been winter gales and storms and fog and the like, but in all my experience, I have never been in any accident of any sort worth speaking about. I have seen but one vessel in distress in all my years at sea, a brig, the crew of which were taken off in a small boat in charge of my third officer. I never saw a wreck and have never been wrecked, nor was I ever in any predicament that threatened to end in disaster of any sort. You see, I am not very good material for a story. Smith began his life far from the sea. He was the son of a potter-turned-grocer in Handley, Stoke-on-Trent. At age 12, he went to work at a local forge, but it was a bad time for the iron industry. For this, he decided to travel to Liverpool when he was 14, signing on to the merchant clipper ship of which his half-brother Joseph was captain. From that moment on, the sea was his life. He joined White Star in 1880 as fourth officer on the Celtic and first sailed as captain aboard Republic in 1887. In 1895, he served as captain of the Majestic for up to 5 years, and during the Boer War, he safely transported troops to South Africa, and King Edward himself awarded him with the Transport Medal. Following his career as captain aboard the Baltic and the Adriatic, he was awarded the decoration for officers of the Royal Naval Reserve. It was just recently that he was commissioned to Olympic. Now, after 32 years and more than 2 million ocean miles of White Star, after achieving the rank of Commodore at more than double the salary of his counterparts on the Cunard Line, the 62-year-old captain was planning to retire when Titanic returned from New York. Captain Smith's favoritism among his officers saw a positive reception from Charles Lightoller. Captain Smith, or EJ, as he was familiarly and affectionately known, was quite a character in the shipping world. Tall, full-whiskered, and broad. At first sight, you would think to yourself, here's a typical Western Ocean captain. Bluff, hardy, and I'll bet he's got a voice like a foghorn. As a matter of fact, he had a pleasant, quiet voice and invariable smile. A voice he rarely raised above a conversational tone. Not to say he couldn't. In fact, I have often heard him bark an order that made a man come to himself with a bump. He was a great favorite, and a man any officer would give his ears to sail under. As the highest paid, most prestigious captain of the White Star Line, Edward J. Smith was free to make the best possible choices for the navigation officers who would be under his immediate command on Titanic's maiden voyage. Chief Officer William Murdoch, First Officer Charles Lightoller, and Second Officer David Blair Smith's first selection of senior officers were drawn from the ranks of men with whom he had sailed on previous voyages. Third Officer Herbert Pittman had been with White Star for 5 years. So had Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall, an ambitious young man who quickly became Smith's favorite. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, although he had been with White Star only a year and had never crossed the Atlantic, had proven himself on ships that served the west coast of Africa. Sixth Officer James Moody was a recent graduate of a navigational school in London. A week before sailing, Captain Smith decided that Titanic would be better served by someone familiar with her sister ship. He requested that Olympics Chief Officer Henry Wilde be transferred to the new liner for her first round trip. This reassignment moved Murdoch down to First Officer, Lightoller down to Second Officer, and David Blair off Titanic. Blair described his reaction in the following letter. Arrived on Titanic from Belfast today. Am afraid I shall have to step out to make room for Chief Officer of the Olympic, who is going in command, but so many ships laid up, he will have to wait. Hope eventually to get back to this ship. Been home all day and down on board tonight on watch. This is a magnificent ship. I feel very disappointed I am not to make the first voyage. Over the next 3 days, more luggage came, and more passengers booked their tickets. It would soon be a week to remember.